7 men witnessed what happened inside that dojo. 7 men, and not one of them ever spoke about it publicly for the rest of their lives. Not because they were sworn to silence, because some things, when you see them, you carry like a wound, not a scar, a wound, something that never fully closes. By the time it was over, 9 of Japan's most feared fighters had been put on the floor. 9 men who had never lost. 9 men who had laughed when they heard a Chinese boy was coming. They stopped laughing on the 3rd day. This is the story they buried, the confrontation that was never filmed, never reported, never acknowledged by any official body, the one that exists only in whispers passed between old masters in closed rooms. This is the story of what Bruce Lee did when they took something from him that could never be replaced. Hong Kong, 1964. The city moved the way it always did, fast, loud, relentless. Markets screaming with vendors, streets thick with the smell of rain and engine oil. A city that never stood still enough to grieve. But in a small apartment in Kowloon, Bruce Lee had gone completely still. He sat on the floor beside a wooden chair. His hands were open on his knees. His eyes were fixed on nothing. His master was dead. Ip Man, the last Grand Master of Wing Chun, the man who had shaped Bruce Lee's hands, his mind, his very understanding of what a human body was capable of, had been attacked 3 weeks earlier. Not in a ring, not in a challenge match, in his own school. A delegation of Japanese fighters had come to Hong Kong under the guise of a cultural exchange, 14 men in total, dressed in formal traveling clothes, polite, formal, carrying gifts. They had asked to study with Ip Man, to observe his methods. Ip Man, being who he was, welcomed them. What happened on the 2nd day was not an exchange, it was a statement. 3 of the largest men in the delegation had moved simultaneously, not in sparring form, but in coordinated assault. Ip Man, 70 years old and weighing less than 130 pounds, had broken 2 noses and dislocated 1 shoulder before they overwhelmed him with sheer mass. He was left on the floor of his own school. He survived, but something inside him didn't. A man at 70, beaten in his own house, it fractures something that medicine cannot reach. He was dead within the year. Bruce Lee was 23 years old when he found out. He had been in America, training, building, preparing for a future that Ip Man had always believed in more than anyone. He got the news in a phone call that lasted 40 seconds. He hung up the telephone. He sat on the floor. He stayed there for 2 hours. Then he stood up, and he made a decision that would define the most dangerous 12 days of his life. The Japanese delegation had returned to Osaka. Their leader was a man named Tanaka Hiroshi. If that name means nothing to you, it should mean everything. In 1964, Tanaka was considered by many serious practitioners of Kyokushin karate to be the most complete fighter in Asia. 6'2", 210 pounds of structured muscle. He had not lost a sanctioned match in 6 years. He was not the most dangerous man in that dojo. That distinction belonged to Mori Kenji, a man who had trained under 3 different masters across 3 different disciplines, judo, Muay Thai, and Okinawan Goju Ryu. The kind of fighter who didn't specialize because he didn't need to. He read bodies the way other men read books, instantly, completely, with cold precision. Then there were the others. Fighters 2 through 8 were ranked accordingly in Tanaka's school. Each had their own specialty. One was known for ground control, one for breaking distance. One, a former military combatives instructor, was known simply for his threshold of pain. He could absorb punishment that would end other men and keep walking forward. These 9 had been together for years. They trained together. They fought together. They had developed the kind of wordless coordination that only comes from shared obsession. They knew Bruce Lee was coming. They had been told 2 days before he arrived. Someone in Hong Kong had warned them, not to help them, to give them what they believed was sufficient time to prepare. They spent those 2 days training. They should have spent them running. Bruce Lee arrived in Osaka on a Tuesday morning. He carried 1 bag. He wore plain clothes, dark trousers, a simple shirt. No ceremony, no announcement. He had traveled alone, told no one where he was going, and made contact with a single intermediary in the city, an old training partner who knew where Tanaka's school was located. He didn't ask for an escort. He didn't ask for a translator. He walked to the dojo alone. The school occupied the ground floor of a building 3 blocks from the Dotonbori Canal, traditional sliding doors, a wooden sign above the entrance with characters Bruce Lee read without difficulty. He stood outside for a moment, not hesitating, just reading the place, taking its measure. Then he stepped inside. There were 11 people in the room when he entered, 9 fighters and 2 observers, younger students who had been permitted to watch. The main training floor was clean, spare, precisely arranged, the smell of wood resin and chalk. Tanaka was standing in the center of the floor. He had clearly expected this arrival to feel like a confrontation. He had positioned himself accordingly, arms loose at his sides, weight balanced, expression practiced into something between contempt and curiosity. Bruce Lee walked to the edge of the training floor and stopped. He said nothing. Tanaka said in Japanese, "We heard you were coming." Bruce Lee replied in Cantonese, which Tanaka did not speak, and then in English, "I know what happened in Hong Kong." The room changed temperature. Not metaphorically, something physical occurred. Even the 2 young observers felt it, a pressure shift, like the air before lightning. Tanaka's expression didn't break. He was too experienced for that. But the men on either side of him, trained fighters, men who had stood in front of genuine violence before, they moved. Subtle adjustments, weight redistributed, hands drifting slightly inward. Their bodies understood something their pride had not yet accepted. Tanaka said, "This is our school. You are a guest. Guests do not make accusations." Bruce Lee looked at him for a long moment. "I'm not a guest. I'm a student, and my teacher is gone." He set down his bag. "I want to understand what your men can do. All of them. One at a time, or however you prefer." Silence. 3 seconds of it. Then Tanaka smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who had been given permission to do something he had already decided to do. "One at a time," he said. "We are not savages." The first fighter was a man named Ota. He was the youngest of the 9, 26, stocky, with the kind of natural power that comes from a frame built wider than it needs to be. He fought in the Kyokushin style, full contact, full commitment, a philosophy that rewards endurance and punishes hesitation. He had knocked out a man with a single body kick the previous month. He bowed to Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee returned the bow. Then Ota attacked. He was fast, genuinely fast, not performer fast, not trained to look fast, real speed, generated from real muscle, aimed with real intent. He covered the distance in under a second. He never arrived. What the observers described later, and what they described only in fragments to people they trusted, was this: Bruce Lee moved left. Not dramatically, not a leap or a dodge, a precise lateral shift of perhaps 8 inches, and as Ota's momentum carried him through the space where Bruce Lee had been, Lee's right hand moved. Once. Ota went down. He was not unconscious, but he was on the floor and he was not getting up quickly, and his breathing had changed in a way that told the room everything they needed to know about where that single strike had landed. The observers looked at each other. The second fighter stepped forward without being asked. His name was Kobayashi. Taller, more technical, a ground specialist who preferred to take fights into close range and then remove them from the standing game entirely. He approached differently than Ota. Slower, lower, measuring. He had watched what happened and made adjustments. They were intelligent. They were not enough. Bruce Lee let him close the distance, let him get one grip, a collar tie, the kind of opening move that chains 10 other moves behind it, the kind of grip that once established puts the grappler in control. For 1.3 seconds, Kobayashi had the grip. Then something happened to his wrist. He released the grip. He did not choose to release it. It was released for him by a pain response so sharp and complete that his hand simply opened. And in the fraction of a second that followed, Bruce Lee moved through the space Kobayashi's grip had occupied and struck twice, once low, once to the jaw, with the precision of a man who had visualized this exact sequence 1,000 times. Kobayashi sat down on the floor. He did not fall. He sat, like a man who had simply decided to rest. The third fighter's name was Daichi, the military man, the one with the high pain threshold, the one who kept walking forward no matter what he absorbed. He studied Bruce Lee for a long moment before moving. Then he said in English, "I have been hit by stronger men than you." "Yes," Bruce Lee said. That was his entire response. Daichi came forward. He ate the first strike and kept moving, which was exactly what his reputation promised. He ate the second strike. His eyes barely registered it. He was inside Bruce Lee's range now, arms wrapping, body mass beginning to establish control. And then something happened that nobody in the room had seen before. He stopped retreating. He planted, and he hit Daichi in a place at an angle with a velocity that no one present had a framework for. This was not a punch from a manual. This was not a technique from any system. This was the culmination of 12 years of obsessive refinement, the product of a man who had dissected the human body, not as a student studies anatomy, but as an engineer studies a problem he intends to solve. Daichi, the man who did not go down, went down. The room was silent. Not quiet, silent. Tanaka stood in the center of the floor and looked at Bruce Lee without expression. 6 fighters remained.
Tanaka did not speak. He didn't need to. A single look toward the fourth man was enough. His name was Fujiwara, the distance specialist, the one who had made a career out of controlling the geometry of a fight, keeping opponents exactly where he wanted them, denying them entry, punishing every attempt to close the gap. He had the longest reach in the room and the technical discipline to use every inch of it. He moved like a man who understood space as a weapon. He circled left, then right, testing, probing, watching Bruce Lee's feet for the telegraphing that every fighter, no matter how skilled, eventually produces. He watched for 4 seconds. He found nothing. No lean, no micro shift of weight, no anticipatory twitch in the shoulders, just a man standing with the stillness of something that has not yet decided to move, but could in any direction without warning. Fujiwara struck first, a long, fast jab, textbook range, designed not to land but to measure, to read the response, to begin the conversation that fighting actually is. Bruce Lee did not respond to the jab. He responded to what the jab meant, to the intention behind it, and he countered the second strike, the real one, the one Fujiwara had set up with the first, before it left the chamber. This was the thing that nobody who studied Bruce Lee could fully explain, and that everybody who fought him mentioned afterward. He didn't react to what you did. He acted on what you were about to do. Fujiwara landed on the floor holding his ribs and breathing in careful, deliberate installments, the way a man breathes when moving hurts, and stillness is the only mercy available. The fifth man was Watanabe, quiet, compact, dark eyes that moved constantly. He had trained in Muay Thai under a Thai master, unusual for a Japanese fighter of that era. He used his elbows the way most men use their fists, as the primary, preferred, finishing tool. One of his elbows had ended a fight in 4 seconds. He didn't circle. He didn't probe. He walked straight forward. There is a particular kind of danger in a man who walks straight at you without fear. It signals either recklessness or certainty. Recklessness is exploitable. Certainty is something else entirely. You cannot use a man's fear against him if he has none. Bruce Lee recognized this. He changed. His stance shifted. His weight dropped imperceptibly lower. He was no longer the same target he had been for the previous 4 men. Watanabe threw an elbow. It missed by 4 inches, which for an elbow at close range is an enormous margin. Bruce Lee moved through the mist like water, moving through a gap in stone. No wasted motion, no theatrical repositioning, just a seamless transition from defense to offense, and then 2 strikes, low and high, delivered in a sequence so compressed that the observers would later argue about whether it was 1 movement or 2. Watanabe did not go down. He stepped back, once, twice. His back found the wall. He stood there with his hands at his sides and looked at Bruce Lee, and then, in front of everyone, he bowed. Not a formal bow, a deep one, the kind that carries more weight than words. The room absorbed this in silence. The sixth man stepped forward. His name was Ishida, a submission specialist, a man who had choked unconscious 17 opponents in competition. Large hands, exceptional timing. He had watched everything carefully and formed a theory. His theory was that Bruce Lee was brilliant in the open, vulnerable at the transition, the moment when a striker becomes a grappler, that half-second of commitment where the geometry shifts. It was an intelligent theory. It was also wrong. Ishida shot low, a genuine takedown attempt, fast and properly timed, aimed at Bruce Lee's hips, the kind of move that bypasses striking entirely and removes a fight from the world where Bruce Lee lived. He covered 2/3 of the distance. He did not cover the last third. What stopped him was a knee, and then, as the knee sent his head upward, the combination that met his face on the way. Ishida hit the floor face first. He rolled onto his back. He stared at the ceiling. He did not get up for a long time. 6 men on the floor, 3 left standing beside Tanaka. The observers in the corner had stopped moving. They stood with the rigid stillness of men who were no longer watching a demonstration of martial skill. They were watching something they had no category for, something that fell outside the language their training had given them. The 7th fighter was called Hayashi. He had said nothing since Bruce Lee arrived. He had watched everything without visible reaction, no tension in his jaw, no shifting of weight, no tells. He was the calmest man in the room after Bruce Lee himself. He bowed. Bruce Lee returned it. What followed was the longest exchange of the day, 40 seconds, which in the compressed universe of actual combat is an enormous span of time. Hayashi was skilled in a way that demanded respect, fought in a way that demanded attention. He found angles. He created problems that required solutions. He was not simply absorbing punishment and falling. He was competing. And he was losing, clearly, progressively, without any possibility of reversal. But he competed. At the end of 40 seconds, he took a strike to the temple that turned his legs to water. He sat down. He shook his head slowly. Not in refusal, but in the way a man shakes his head when a truth has been delivered that he wasn't prepared to receive. The 8th man did not bow. His name was Saito, and Saito was angry. The first genuinely angry man Bruce Lee had faced in that room, and anger, in a trained fighter, is not always a liability. Sometimes anger simplifies the problem, removes hesitation, creates a pressure that technique alone cannot generate. Saito came fast and hard, with the kind of committed violence that doesn't pause to calculate. For 3 seconds, the room held its breath. Then it was over. Saito was on the floor, and Bruce Lee was standing exactly where he had been standing before the exchange began. No adjusted footing, no transition. As if the previous 3 seconds had been a brief interruption in his stillness rather than a fight. Saito lay on his side, breathing, alive. But somewhere in the architecture of his certainty, something had been permanently dismantled. 8 men on the floor.
Tanaka Hiroshi had not moved from the center of the room. Through all of it, all 8 men, all the silence and the sounds of impact and the careful breathing of defeated fighters, he had stood in the same position, watching, learning, processing. He was the best of them, and he knew it. He also knew, by the time the 8th man went down, that it was not going to be enough. Not because he lacked skill, not because he lacked courage. He had both in abundance. He knew it wasn't going to be enough because of something he had observed that none of the others had the experience to identify. Bruce Lee was not tired. 8 fights. The last one had lasted 40 seconds, and the man standing across from him was breathing at the same rate he had been breathing when he walked through the door. That was not human. That was not the product of superior technique or superior strength. That was something else, a different category of physical existence. A man who had pressed his body so far past ordinary limits that the limits no longer applied. Tanaka removed his jacket. He folded it. He set it on the floor beside him. He bowed. "I know who you are," he said. Bruce Lee said nothing. "I know what we did in Hong Kong. I was not there, but I know." Still nothing. "It does not matter that I was not there." Bruce Lee looked at him for a long moment. "No," he said quietly. "It doesn't." Tanaka nodded. And then he attacked. What followed lasted 11 seconds. Those 11 seconds have been described differently by the 2 observers who were present, not because they saw different things, but because the human eye, confronted with movement at that velocity and that precision, fills in the gaps with whatever framework it has available, and neither observer had a framework sufficient to the task. What they agreed on was this. Tanaka was exceptional. He landed. He scored. He moved with the intelligence of a man who had spent 6 years as the best fighter in Asia, and he fought at the absolute ceiling of his capability. He gave everything he had. He hit the floor in 11 seconds. He was not unconscious. He was simply stopped. On his back, staring upward,
with the expression of a man who has arrived at a conclusion he had been avoiding. Bruce Lee stood over him. He did not stand over him with aggression. He did not stand over him with triumph. He stood over him the way a man stands at the end of something that needed to be finished. "Tell me their names," Bruce Lee said. Tanaka closed his eyes. A long breath. Then he said 3 names. The 3 men from Hong Kong. The ones who had gone to Ip Man's school. The ones who had initiated what happened there. Bruce Lee committed them to memory. Then he turned, picked up his bag, and walked to the door. He stopped at the threshold. He did not turn around. "Your school can remain open," he said. "This was not about your school." He walked out. The door slid closed behind him. Nobody in that room moved for 60 seconds. The 2 observers never taught publicly again. Not because they were forbidden, because every time they stood in front of a training class and began to explain the principles of combat, distance, timing, power generation, they heard an echo, a memory of 11 seconds that made everything they were saying feel profoundly, irreparably incomplete. The 9 fighters recovered. Physically, most of them recovered well. Hayashi went on to become a respected instructor. Watanabe, the one who had bowed at the wall, reportedly spent the following 2 years attempting to understand what he had experienced, studying movement theory in ways he had never considered before. Tanaka never fought competitively again. He did not announce retirement. He simply stopped entering competitions. When students asked him why, he gave different answers at different times. Age, injury, philosophy. Never the true answer. No photographs were taken that day. No documentation exists. No official report was ever filed. The story spread anyway, because stories like this cannot be contained. They travel through the closed channels of serious practitioners, passed from master to student, from one closed dojo to another, carried in the way that significant truths are always carried, quietly, between people who understand the weight of what they're holding. In those tellings, the details shift. The number of fighters changes. The location moves. The duration expands. That is what happens to a story that becomes a legend. It grows until it is the right size for what it represents. What it represents is this. A man who had lost the most important teacher of his life walked into a room full of enemies and demonstrated something that had nothing to do with revenge. It had to do with truth. The truth of what a human being becomes when grief and discipline and absolute commitment to mastery arrive at the same moment in the same body, and the body is finally asked to speak. Bruce Lee never spoke about those 12 days in Osaka. Not in interviews, not in the books he wrote, not in any conversation that was ever recorded or reported. It existed for him the way a scar exists. Present, real, part of the structure, but not something you announce. What he did speak about, constantly, obsessively, from every platform his growing fame eventually gave him, was the thing those 9 men had forced him to use. Not strength, not size, not the accumulated weight of a larger body. Precision. The less effort, he said, the faster and more powerful you will be. He was not speaking about efficiency as a tactical preference. He was speaking about it as a principle of existence. The idea that waste, wasted motion, wasted energy, wasted emotion, wasted time, is the only real enemy. That a human being operating at the intersection of complete knowledge and complete calm is capable of things that a human being operating on power alone will never reach. Size is a number. Speed is an argument. But precision, the kind that comes from years of absolute dedication, from grief transformed into purpose, from love for a teacher converted into mastery of everything that teacher gave you, precision is an answer. The 9 fighters in Osaka did not lose because they were weaker. Several of them were considerably stronger. They did not lose because they lacked courage. Most of them had genuine courage. They lost because they came to that room believing that what they had was enough. Bruce Lee had spent his entire life operating on a different premise, that enough is never enough, that the work is never finished, that the man who walks through the door tomorrow must be better than the man who walked through the door today. Ip Man had taught him that, not as a lesson, as a life lived in front of him, day after day, in a small school in Hong Kong where a tiny man in simple clothes had shown a young boy that the most powerful thing a human being can possess is not muscle, not aggression, not size. It is understanding. Understanding of the body, understanding of the opponent, understanding of the space between them and the time they share, and what can be made of both if you have paid, truly paid, the price that mastery demands. Bruce Lee paid that price every day of his life, and on 12 days in Osaka in 1964, 9 of the most dangerous men in Asia discovered, one by one, in 11 seconds or 40, or a single unreadable instant, what that payment had purchased. They came to that room expecting to face a man. What they faced was a question. The question every martial artist must eventually answer, not in competition, not in theory, but in the silence between heartbeats when something real is happening. How far are you willing to go? Bruce Lee's answer was already in the room before he arrived. It had been there since the day Ip Man's school went quiet, and a young man who had been shaped by the greatest hands in the history of Wing Chun decided that the only worthy tribute to a lost master is to carry what he gave you further than he ever imagined it to go. Not for revenge, for proof. Using no way as way, having no limitation as limitation. Bruce Lee. If this story moved you, if you felt something in those 11 seconds, then you already understand what Bruce Lee spent his life trying to tell the world. Subscribe, because the stories that don't make history books are always the ones worth knowing. Hit the bell. The next one goes even deeper.